start out and just introduce ourselves, and then talk a little bit about who we are and what we do, and then let all of you guys introduce yourselves. Because at the end of the day, like, it's our goal to get some good, solid information to you. But in order to help us do that, we want to know a little bit about who you are and what you do and what brought you here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of as we go. But as Jonathan said, my name is Jeff. I own Common Cause Catering and Local Relic. Common Cause Catering is a 5-year, successful, profitable social enterprise catering company. We talk a lot about how we're not we're a change the world company. We're not a food company. Food is just our mechanism to be able to change the world. So where a catering company needs people to cut onions and carry trays and wash dishes and load trucks and do all those things, we have a pretty extensive network in the community. We could reach out and find people that have that experience. Instead, we approach it from the other side and try and figure out how to develop relationships in order to find people who can benefit from learning those job skills and provide job skills training and life skills training. So we have partnerships primarily with Catholic Charities in the Marian House and Partners in Housing, who are 2 great nonprofits who do a lot of casework and case management to help people get back to self-sufficiency. One of the areas where most nonprofits, and those 2 nonprofits specifically, are lacking is in the job training side. You know, they can bring you in like for an interview class or for a Dress for Success class or something like that. But as far as actual real marketable job skills, it's easy to find a job if you have a job. It's hard to get that first foot in the door. And so we have, and we can talk more about this later, kind of depending on where the conversation goes. But the goal is to help individuals re-enter the workforce, get back to self-sufficiency, and kind of move out on their own. I'll talk more about that later, about kind of how we started and why we picked the entity we did, because we'll play along in the same group exercise that we'll do partway through. Okay,
great. And as Jonathan stated, I'm Joanne Schmitz. I started my career, I'm a UCCS grad, yay. And I started my career in the 80s, and for the first 20 years I worked in high tech. So I did everything from product development, purchasing, operations management, and ended up in product management and marketing, doing forecasting, all that kind of good stuff, writing business plans. And then I sort of had a midlife crisis and decided to go to law school. So I've been, which I think I shared with you, it'd been cheaper to buy a car than pay law school tuition.
Probably 2 cars now.
Yeah, right. And so I've been working with companies, startup to mid-sized companies for about 10 to 15 years. And I love working with everybody who's got great ideas. So that's why I'm here.
So this is our agenda for today. We're going to talk about kind of, first is the corporate book, which is kind of like the guts of what the kind of the brain or the nerve center maybe, or the dictionary, I don't know, of your company. We'll talk about kind of how that relates to social impact business, what the idea of a social impact business is. We'll go through the group activity that I just alluded to. We'll kind of sandwich the bulk of our conversation around legal entities with that group activity in the beginning and the end. And then talk a little bit about certifications, some other legal things that you might want to think about. And depending on how quickly we move through this conversation, we may have a chance to talk a little bit more in depth about some of those. And then talk about kind of the next steps.
Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit about your corporate book. And I have to say, this is probably the yawner slide of the day. Well, there's maybe a couple, but this one is up there. And I have worked with startups and mid-sized businesses for probably over 10 years. And when they come to start up, yay, it's always exciting. It's a happy time. But sometimes companies come to me after they've been established, and it's maybe we're more in damage control or trying to pick up the pieces from things that didn't happen initially. So I'm real adamant about creating a corporate book, and it can be a folder with sub-files electronically. In 10 years, one client actually came in with one. And it was so helpful because it was a litigation matter, and he had everything that we needed right there. Another reason to have a corporate book is if you're thinking about an exit strategy, pretty much everything that somebody would want to do around your company from a due diligence standpoint will exist here if you have the discipline to keep it together. So the sections that I've identified, and if you come up with a better idea than corporate book to name this, I'll buy you lunch after the seminar, because I know that's such a yawner. But the formation documents, any amendments that you might do to those during the life of your company, and then your annual reports with the Colorado Secretary of State, all should just go right there. So they're ready to go. If you have a board of directors or officers, if you're an LLC, to have a group of manager members, if you have any meetings, you want to just jot down 2 or 3 lines. It doesn't have to be big and complicated. Say, hey, we reviewed the lease, or we had an attorney review the lease, we approved the lease. Any kind of big decisions like that you want to have in your minutes. Maybe you hire a key employee, so you talk about, how you determine that or something to that effect, but not a lot of detail there. Year-end financials, so every year you want to have your financials. Kind of the summary sheets, and I'm excited to share that my first year out I actually made $139 it was, so I got my financials in there for the whole $139. If you're going to focus on the social impact elements, and in Colorado we have just identified a public benefit corporation, if you go that route in forming your entity, you're statutorily required to file an annual report around how you're impacting whatever it is you're wanting to impact. We're terming that the social return on investment is the S, Jonathan,
Yep.
social
Yep.
return on investment, so SROI instead of straight up ROI. But you're going to want to have a section for that. Ownership records and agreements, so this would be like if you're a corporation, you're going to have your ledger of who owns the stock. If you're an LLC, you're going to want to have either a membership ownership percentage statement, or the equivalent of stock in an LLC is a unit. So you would say you own 1,000 units, you own 1,000 units, so forth. So you have the records and you know clearly who owns the company. And then if you have like a shareholder agreement, so you say, you can't sell your shares to anybody unless I agree to that person, so forth. Those kind of agreements, you want that kept as well. Intellectual property documentation, that's really important because that's a place where you actually can start generating some actual value to your company. So you want to be able to demonstrate to somebody who's interested in that, yep, I have this name and it's trademarked, and here's my document, so forth. Contracts. Also in the intellectual property documentation, you want to keep your non-disclosure agreements. So you just put them right in that folder so you know who you talked to on what date. And I actually advise you, if you've used slides in that presentation, to put those slides right behind your non-disclosure, so that if you ever have to go and litigate, say somebody stole your idea, well, you can say you signed a non-disclosure, here's our slides, and this is what we talked about on that date. It's very, very powerful evidence for you in a litigation standpoint. Under contracts, you might have vendor contracts. A real basic contract that a lot of companies have initially is a lease. So you keep your lease and any lease amendments there. Any employee agreements. In the social impact arena, we're talking about a lot of different certifications. And Jonathan's going to talk about that a little bit more later. And then awards, because your company is going to win great awards when you execute your plan. So you want to keep all that together.
Well, and so, yeah, so I sort of look at this as an operator. It's great to have like the legal opinion on it. I look at it as an operator and it's like, well, gosh, this is a lot of work. This is a lot of detail. This is a lot of stuff that is a pain in the butt to keep together. At the end of the day, it's kind of like a prenup. A lot of these things are really easy to find early, and they're really easy to keep track of as you go. It's really hard if you find yourself in an argument with a co-founder or with a landlord or with somebody who's violated non-disclosures and intellectual property. It's a lot harder to come back and fill in this stuff after the fact. And it's, if you were to ask a lawyer, she would probably tell you that you don't want to draft this stuff the day before you have to go in front of a judge or in front of a litigator or somebody and be like, oh yeah, well this is all stuff that, like, I put this binder together yesterday, the stuff that we talked about 4 years ago. You're gonna find yourself in a pickle pretty quick.
Right.
I expect.
And I think a long time after that conversation, the moods can change around that conversation, memories can change around what was stated. And it's a very expensive proposition if you become successful. Like, I would say $20,000 to $40,000 easily to sort out a dispute with your partner if you become successful. And that's just for who I would be representing, not who's on the other side. So, I mean, everybody, I'm not encouraging you to budget massive amounts for legal expenses, but you have to be realistic and put something in there so you get yourself set up properly.
And it's worth noting before we talk about entities that this stuff really applies to any entity regardless of
Right.
type.
Yep. Okay.
You said that was required for the social impact reports?
The external reports,
Were you saying that was something that was newly required?
yes, it is newly required if you choose a public benefit corporation under Colorado law. It's required. And the law for the public benefit corporation, I think it's like only 5 or 6 pages, so it's not real big. Basically, you have to do everything you have to do for a regular corporation, plus some more.
So we'll spend a little time talking later about why a public benefit corp may be a good entity choice for you or why it may not be a good entity choice for you. So I don't want to scoop ourselves, but we'll come back to some of those points. So there's 3. So as we talk about corporate book and all that, it's worth noting that there are really kind of 3 ways to come to a social impact business. One is to have a cool idea and to understand kind of this idea of social impact businesses and social enterprise and conscious capitalism and all of those things and say, okay, well, I have this idea, I believe in the idea of a social impact business, and so I'm going to start as a social impact business from day one. Another is, and we see this a lot as we're out talking with individuals, is existing nonprofits that say, okay, we want to we understand the challenges related to funding, and we understand the grant scene is getting tighter, and there's questions about government funding and kind of how that looks going into the future. We saw lots of nonprofits struggle. I'm sure you did. Saw a lot of nonprofits struggling in 2008 with a downturn in the economy. That, if your goal is to feed people or to house people or to provide medical care for people or whatever, and right at the time when the economy is crashing, that's your clients' needs are blowing up. At the same time, your donor base is contracting. And so lots of nonprofits are saying, well, like social enterprise is the savior. We can generate our own revenue, and then we don't need a grant writer. We don't need donors anymore. We can just generate our own cash flow. And there are a few that have proven to be really successful. There's a lot that are still kind of toying with the idea and haven't really gotten there. And then the third real way to arrive at this is an existing for-profit that has figured out, and a lot of times I think you see this with smaller corporations or smaller partnerships or LLCs, where they come back and say, okay, well, we figured out we can pay ourselves, we can do good for ourselves, we want to also do good for the community. It's worth noting that social impact business is not necessarily this idea of CSR, corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility kind of starts to fall towards the idea of social impact business, but the idea of corporate social responsibility is to say, okay, well, we're going to donate, if we donate 1% of sales back. Like, well, that's all well and good, but are you really trying to maximize your community good, or is it just a marketing ploy? Do you put, a big flashy thing on your website that you give 1% back, hoping that it will attract customers? I know we've talked about that in some of the other classes, and I expect you'll hear more about it as we move into the class with Jonathan and Forrest about telling your story. But I think there's a slippery slope between corporate social responsibility and a social impact business. And there are companies that are successfully navigating that. Jonathan likes to talk about Patagonia a lot. Take him out for coffee, I'll tell you all about them. But they have done a really successful job, not necessarily of navigating how to convert to a public benefit corporation from a for-profit. They really were a public benefit corporation before anybody really coined the term or before there was any legal structure to it, but they did a good job of navigating the change to the actual legal entity that supports what's on their heart.
Mm-hmm. Now, I can just piggyback off that. I think kind of the range that I'm looking at is a company might have some kind of marketing plan to attract a particular segment under kind of the guise of social impact versus living and breathing it. And we're talking today about kind of the living and breathing it between the products, your supply chain, how you treat your employees, the whole gamut. So that's kind of the difference in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that, I suspect.
Okay, so this is our first Colorado Revised Statutes test. And this is the legal definition for a public benefit corporation. And I put it in here because I think it is helpful when you start thinking about what you might want to do. So it kind of starts out very general, like one or more positive effects or reduction of negative effects. That's pretty general. On one or more categories of persons, again, very general. It could be a company, like an entity, a community, or interest. It says an interest other than a shareholder interest because they have a monetary interest in the performance of the company. And it can include, so this is the whole broad range of things that you could think about. Artistic, charitable, cultural, economic, educational, environmental, literary, medical, religious, scientific, or technological nature. So it's a huge, broad range. So depending on what state you're in the United States versus the various entities that you can choose, some of the state statutes say they just say you're going to do a public benefit very generally, and some require you to specifically identify what benefit you're doing. In Colorado, we allow you to do either. So you can, and the idea there is that you yourself or your managers or officers can decide what that benefit is specifically, that the legislature is not going to dictate to you how you have to define your public benefits. Okay, does anybody have any questions on that? Because it's going to become more apparent here in a little bit. Okay.
Yeah. So I clicked over to the next slide here. So so Joanne was just saying either a general public benefit or a specific public benefit. You can identify it, but you don't need to.
You have to do at least one.
Correct. And so on this list here where they talk about artistic, charitable, cultural, economic, educational, environmental, literary, medical, religious, scientific, or technological, I challenge you to find any business anywhere at least in the state of Colorado, that you couldn't somehow shoehorn into one of those. Which is nice that the legislature basically said, like, okay, here's an impossibly broad list. Come up with any idea you want and fit it in there, which is nice. Some common examples that we see in social enterprises out kind of in the wild are job training and employment for people who are hard to employ. We, as Common Cost Catering, are one example of that. My favorite example of it is Bluestar Recyclers. Have you heard Bluestar? I know we talk about them a lot in these things. So they are, if you don't know, they are a company that recycles electronics. And so they charge individuals to bring in old TVs and stuff. And then they have individuals with autism that are breaking those, a TV or an old computer or whatever, into all of its different components. And so the plastic goes here and the glass goes here and the silicone goes here and whatever, because each component is recyclable separately, but it's not on the whole. And so they generate their own revenue, but their goal is environmental, which is the next one, but their goal is also to employ people. And so the really powerful and compelling social enterprise stories, or social impact business stories that we hear, tend to hit on more than one of either these kind of in the wild examples or more than one of these examples that's in the statute. The more kind of boxes you can tick off, that's when you really start to have a compelling story. So environmental health impact, whether that's sometimes related to environmental or can be about health and wellness or about food security or about any of those things, nutrition education, that kind of stuff. One-for-one model like Tom's Shoes, anything related to local and responsible sourcing, livable wages, employee ownership. I could have filled up 3 slides just with potential examples on them. But again, I think the value and the impact and the compelling story really comes from how many of these boxes can you tick off. So if you're really just saying like, oh, well, we're a restaurant, we're going to locally source our food. That's good, but are you a social enterprise or are you really just locally sourcing because you believe in locally sourcing? Like, you're not compelling yet. But when you talk about, well, we're also going to work with hard-to-employ individuals, and we want to do some nutrition education around the food we're doing, and we want to make sure that, all of our entrees are less than 600 calories. And the more of those things you can get, now I start to believe that your heart and your mission are aligned, and it's not just my mission is to make money, or my heart is to make money, and I'm going to talk loosely about this mission to convince people that they should give me money.
I think you should add on-site daycare to that list.
Yeah. Yeah. Jonathan? You were saying last week about what company is it? Is it Patagonia that has on-site daycare?
Yeah, they have like 20 years or like another year.
Yeah.
They're doing it more popular.
Yeah. As a mom, I've already raised my kids, but that would have been so wonderful to have on-site daycare.
I used to work for a company, and that was one of the things that we always said is, like, imagine how absenteeism goes down, loyalty goes up, turnover goes down. Like, there's so many great benefits that come out of it. And the reality is you can make money at it as a company. Like, it can be, it's ancillary income. It's probably small relative to what you're doing. And your goal is not necessarily to make money off the backs of your employees, but at the very least, it doesn't have to cost you anything.
And I think it can help you employ good employees that are, it's a good benefit to have as an employer.
Yeah. So.
And you're all going to have that problem in 6 months.
Yeah. So can you take any business model and say, well, we're going to add on-site daycare. Now we're a social impact business. Like, again, probably not. There aren't a lot of like easy turnkey solutions like that. But the more of them you can pile on, again, the more compelling your case gets.
And it might be a continuum, just saying. Okay, you're the tell us your dream, man.
Yeah, so I want to go back around the room again and kind of talk about the business model either that you're dreaming of or that is already running or whatever. Give us kind of your 30-second elevator pitch for what the company is. And if you don't have one, that's okay. I'll go first, so you'll get a little second to think. So tell us what kind of your 30-second elevator pitch. Tell us what your goal is. Tell us what problems you're trying to solve, and tell us where your revenue comes from. Because these are all important things kind of to have in the front of your mind as we go through and talk about what the available legal entities are. Also know that we'll circle and do this exact same activity again after we talk about legal structures, but we'll make you take a guess as to which legal structure you think makes the most sense for the idea that you've pitched. So, questions at all before we start?
That's a lot.
It's kind of a lot. Again, in the goal of us being more conversational and less preachy, we really want to hear from you guys. And we get excited about talking about social enterprise. So.
Yep, we do.
So I told you a little bit about our catering company. That's been running for 5 years, so I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm going to talk about our newest one, which is a brewery and restaurant concept. It's called Local Relic. We have beer in 22 liquor stores and 5 restaurants, so we're already operating. We already have positive cash flow, which is pretty exciting. But I love social enterprise and social impact business, and so our goal, again, was not to start a brewery. It was to start a Change the World company. Just like our catering company is a food company, but really the mission is to change the world. The brewery is kind of the same thing. And so the way that operates, or the way that we are kind of growing into that mission is we bought an old church, which is pretty cool. And we are developing kind of a restaurant incubator and like food and beverage concept for it. So our main room is 3,000 square feet. We'll have a beer bar in one corner, we'll have a wine and cocktail bar in the other, and then we'll have 4 food vendors. We're looking for vendors who are either small local restaurants who are looking to test out new concepts, or individuals who have kind of come up through the culinary ranks in a restaurant and are looking to try to set out on their own. We want to be an incubator in the sense that they can come and they don't need to be good at marketing, they don't need to be good at accounting, they don't need to be good at all the legal stuff, they don't need to have all of these things that you need to be a successful small business operator. You just need to be good at food. So we want you to come in, be good at food, put out just like a small menu, prove your concept, spend 12 months with us, be able to show, here's how many Facebook followers we have, here's all of our sales numbers, here's how we're local sourcing. We did a pop-up dinner and we sold out in 20 minutes. And kind of take that year's worth of experience and now go out to funders, whether it's banks or social impact investors or whatever it may be, to try to set out and open their own places. Within that, we want to build some job training components. We want to build some local sourcing components. We want to build some community engagement amongst our customers. And so the goal really is to help foster small social impact businesses on their own. We want to kind of give them room to test out ideas, help them be successful in that first 12 months, and then push them out into the world. So the problems that we're trying to solve are access to employment for individuals coming out of tough situations. We're trying to solve the dichotomy in the local food scene that is everybody claims they want to eat local, but nobody actually does. And so because nobody's actually buying local, there's not a lot of people growing local. And so because there's not a lot of people growing local, there's not a lot of people buying local. And it's sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And so we want to try and break that cycle. And then maybe the third problem, and this is kind of a little bit more loosely defined. I have some stuff, but I'm not ready to talk about it yet. Around getting like-minded, community-minded people in the same room, sharing a beer, talking about how they want to change the world, and then capture some of those conversations and help push those. And so that's our goal and the problems we're trying to solve. Our revenue comes from selling food and beer and wine and spirits.
Which I can't say enough about that statement. You definitely, when you're putting your company together, you need to think about how you're going to fund it, because if you're not sustainable, if you don't have money coming in the door, it's going to be tough and painful to realize your dream.
Well, maybe, depending on what your legal entity of choice is. So if you can generate your own revenue, then that's good. If your answer is like, well, I'm going to make a pitch on my website and I'm going to ask for donations, there's a legal entity for that too. But yes, you're right. It will still be.
There's a lot more competition for
there
funding. So let's hear from you. Anybody want to start? We're going to move on here to legal entities, and the question is, why bother forming one? And this doesn't really, this applies whether you're social impact or just straight up nonprofit or even for-profit. And the idea is you want to shift any liability for business decisions to that entity. The laws allow us to create this fictional entity, so instead of you being personally liable for some product issues or whatever, it shifts to the company. So that's the real reason you want to do it. A couple notes that if you don't get around to forming a legal entity, then you're a sole proprietorship, and that means all the liability belongs on you. There's no benefit at all there with a liability shift. Partnerships, if you have a partnership agreement, it probably discusses what liability you're exposed to. One thing that you should know around Colorado law, the law around partnership says, and I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but it says if 2 or more people meet with the idea of forming a or doing something to make a profit, you're a partnership, period. Whether you ever get around to forming an entity or not, you're a partnership. Now, if you don't get around to formalizing your relationship, say that partner goes out and does a lease. It says you're both going to guarantee it for the next 10 years. You're on the hook for that under Colorado law. So whatever you do not want to have kind of informal business working relationship because you can be exposed to a lot of financial liability. And that's the second note. You know, if you don't bother to document your partnership, you're in trouble. The next question I get a lot is, when should I form a company? So this is, you know, kind of my line of questioning. If you've met more than 3 or 4 times with somebody to explore a business idea, it's time to get it formalized, because at that point, you're a partnership under Colorado law, undocumented partnership, and that is very bad. And I have used that in litigation, so it's something I just can't say enough, that you want to formalize your relationship. Establishing ownership percentages. So what happens is people start working together. They may form an LLC, and you know they haven't really gotten around to who owns the LLC, exactly how much. And so then 6-8 months down the line, when it gets tough, kind of when the romantic notion of starting a company wears out, you have an argument. And then it's like, who's going to actually make this decision? I worked harder, I should own 60% of this business. I encourage you all to, if you're working with partners, to establish those things in the very beginning of the business. They're hard conversations when you start out, and they're harder 6 months later when you're having a falling out or a dispute.
Or somebody wants to come and buy you for $1 million.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out how to divide up the $1 million.
Yeah.
It's probably an equally challenging conversation there. It doesn't
is the
have to
sign?
be, like I'm kind of joking about that. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's not necessarily just to protect you for bad times. It's also good to know in good times.
Yep, exactly. The other thing is, who has the final authority for decision making. So like if you're going to buy a big piece of equipment or something, you don't want to come in one day and find out your partner did that and didn't consult you. Whenever you get to the point of owning something, like intellectual property is an early one. If you trademark your name, you want that in the name of the company. You don't want it in any individual names. If you purchase equipment, so forth. Product or service development, that's always dicey, because a lot of times you'll come with an idea and you kind of know how to do it, and somebody else pairs up with you from a financial standpoint. So the two of you get together, I have the know-how, I have the funding, and then it really gets dicey again as to who owns how much of the company. Usually the person who brings the money figures they own like 80 or 90%. I mean, that's just how it works. And so you need to establish that up front, that, hey, my idea has value, it's worth X amount. And then if you sign any contract, for the most part, you want that contract to be written to your company, not to you personally. When you get to a lease point, a lot of times there's pressure for you to personally guarantee that lease value because your company's new, you don't have an established track record. And the landlords will always tell you or portray to you that that's a non-negotiable thing. I have not signed a lease guarantee in probably 6 to 8 years, because I'm just like, I like the space, it's right, I'm not going to guarantee it. And so if you're the right tenant, that is very negotiable. Or you maybe negotiate, okay, it ratchets down. Like for 2 years, I'm only responsible for 20% of the lease or something like that. So it's negotiable. Everything's negotiable. That's kind of the big takeaway today, is everything is negotiable. Okay, so we're going to have to kind of buzz through this because we're out of time.
Well, I say, do we just want to hand out the filled in one, and you can just talk through it?
Yeah. So your homework was to fill this out. We were going to fill this out together, and it's a lot more scary than it actually is. So this is a kind of a revised entity comparison spreadsheet that I put together recently. And you can see the entity type that goes down the left side of the column, and the first one is a corporation. That's the one that most of us are familiar with. You would file with the Colorado Secretary of State articles of incorporation in that first box up here. Your user manual for that is a set of bylaws. You've probably all heard the term bylaws. The ownership in that context is stockholders. And what is kind of intriguing about that in the context of social impact is it does leave open the employee stock option ownership, an ESOP program. Ownership transfer is either a stock exchange or you might have a shareholder agreement. And the drawback on a corporation is you're taxed at the business level, and then you're also taxed at the shareholder level for dividends. So that's kind of the drawback, and that's probably beyond where any of the business ideas I've heard today. It's beyond where you would want to be. A closed corporation is basically the same thing as a public corporation, except for it's privately held. It's like if you have a family business and you incorporate as a corporation. A closed just means it's privately held, it's not publicly traded. The subchapter S corporation is kind of like a mini corporation, would be one way to look at that. You still have articles of incorporation and bylaws, but statutorily, you're limited to the number of shareholders. The shareholders must be U.S. citizens. You can only have one type of stock in that context. So that's where it kind of becomes like the little mini type corporation. The cool thing about that is corporate law has been around forever. So if you talk about corporation kind of activities and internal things that happen, people like particularly banks and so forth get on board fairly quickly with what you're doing. You can...
almost everything around it has been litigated. So you're unlikely to find yourself in a situation where it's like, oh, we don't know. The courts haven't really sorted that piece out yet.
Right.
On corporations, it's all been sorted out.
Yeah, and you'll see on bullet number 2, I just think this is a fun fact. The first corporation that I could find was around 527 to 565 AD in Rome. So they have been around a long time. And then the thing about subchapter S corporations is you can declare with the IRS that you want the taxation to be passed through, so you get past that double taxation scenario. What that means is if the company has a profit, that profit flows to the shareholders based on their ownership percentage. If you have a loss, that passes through to the shareholders. Okay? The public benefit corporation, that's kind of Colorado's latest answer to social impact type companies. It was, I guess, accepted by the legislature in 2013, so it hasn't been around a long time, but it's been in discussion as a nation. There's been organizations that have been discussing it for some time. To become a public benefit corporation, you have to follow the additional Colorado statutes, but in your articles of incorporation, you have to identify what your social impact need is. So you identify that right up front. It's out there publicly to say, our need is employing the unemployable or whatever that public benefit is. And then you also need to identify that in your bylaws, which I call your user manual and how you operate your company. In that context, you're probably looking for shareholders that have social impact needs. So they're willing to give your company money, and they're willing to take less of a return back because they know that some of that profit will go to help some social need. Everything else is pretty much the same. The one odd thing on the public benefit corporation is your directors now must balance, and this is on a slide later, but they have to balance multiple things when they're making a decision, like the public benefit, the impact to the shareholders, that kind of stuff, which it's another layer of complexity for your management team. Nonprofit, which I think a lot of you are really in the nonprofit category. Again, you have articles of incorporation bylaws. The community kind of owns it. The directors are selected by community. Depending on what you're doing, you might still be subject to taxation. That's kind of, I put a little bit in there in a footnote. The one that I'm really liking right now is limited liability companies. They're massively flexible. You can identify, instead of articles of incorporation, you have articles of organization. In those articles of an organization, under Colorado law, you're allowed to do whatever you want to do, profit, nonprofit, and you can identify in your articles of organization that this is a company that has the following social requirements. You can put that in there, and there's no problem with that. You can also identify in your operating agreement what your social impact goals are and how the company is going to respond to that. You identify the members. One cool thing is other entities could own you, so if you get to more complex things, a nonprofit may own an LLC, which could generate revenue back to fund the nonprofit. It's a more complicated way. I think nobody here yet is to that point, but that option is open under an LLC. You can have multiple classes of ownership. You have pass-through taxation, and you can identify that the member managers have this balancing requirement. Now, the great thing about the LLC versus the public benefit corporation is it doesn't require you statutorily to do all the things like the annual report. And I'm looking at that right now, particularly when you're starting out. All that is overhead. I mean, you definitely want to measure your impact, but under the public benefit corporation, you have to do that from a transparency standpoint. So you can do everything you want to do under an LLC, but you don't have all the accountability requirements yet. As you grow, you may want to shift to the accountability scenario because that, from a legitimacy, transparency, that will help you. And then obviously joint ventures. So if you have one piece of the pie and somebody else has another part of a delivery system or something, you can partner together. You don't have to be the same entity, but this company could partner with this company to deliver whatever the social impact is.
That one looks a little scary from a legal perspective, though. Is it scary?
As long as you have your agreement written out so that you know who makes what decisions and financial responsibility, all that kind of stuff, you're okay. But you do have to have a written agreement in place.
The reality is those are all conversations that you should be having anyway, whether it's with another individual that you're trying to start a company with, or it's a partnership that you're working with an existing LLC or with an existing nonprofit. That's like, yeah, I mean, you can stick your tongue out at how distasteful or challenging those conversations are, but they need to be had in any context.
And actually, it's the anticipation on those is usually worse than the actual conversation.
Is there just a general operating agreement and then you tweak it to what you want, or?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so like, say, for example, if you went to any law firm and you said, I want to be an LLC, and I have two people who own the company, so forth, we have forms that we use. I know that that's something that a lot of attorneys don't want to tell you about, but we have forms, and so we interview you, we put the information in properly. We don't write those every time from scratch. And I'm not trying to diss our profession, but if you run into somebody and they want some, like, $1,000 or $2,000 to do this, I mean, that is just grossly overpriced. It should be just an hour or two of their time, unless you have something massively complicated. Okay, the next one is entity selection considerations, and I'll move through these fairly quickly, but part of the reason we wanted you to kind of go through the process of defining what it is you want to do, you need to have a pretty good handle on that when you're choosing the type of entity structure that you want. You must identify how the company is going to be managed. The third bullet is, how are you going to generate revenue? Are you going to generate money through products and services, or are you going to generate the funding through grants, foundational donations, that kind of thing? And then the second thing, or number 4, is, are you generating your capital, which is your startup capital through impact type investors, or again, foundation and grants, which would be more towards the nonprofit side. You have to think about tax implications. In some scenarios, you're going to be able to give tax deductible donations. In some scenarios, you may not. I think it's unclear under a public benefit corporation yet, because the IRS has not caught up with us, if you can give tax deductible donations in that context. I don't know. I haven't really pressed the answer on that, but I haven't seen it either. And then the desired level of transparency. That's the whole thing about the reporting. Again, do you want to have to report? And at some level, there's an argument that gives you discipline to do so. On the other hand, it's overhead. So you have to, those are things that you have to balance.
So your corporation is its own entity. Like it's its own person for the purposes of law. And so there's a value for it to define your relationship with your company's relationship. Because if you don't define what your company is separately from you, then you're just a sole proprietorship and you don't get any of the liability protection or anything else. And so it's, and we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about accounting and finance, about some of the places, you know, the whole premise of piercing the corporate veil and when are you acting as yourself versus when are you acting as your company and
the
some
whole
of that kind
alter
of stuff.
ego, are you using this company as your alter ego?
Exactly,
I'm sure
yeah.
you've heard that term. Okay, so I'm going to, because of where we are in time, I'm going to pop through the next few slides. I do have the nonprofit corporation slide, which since a lot of you are feeling like you might be in that zone, some pros of being a nonprofit is you can completely focus your energies on whatever that public benefit is. So you don't have to worry about the whole, I guess, things that go along with generating revenue, like supply chains and inventory and all those kind of things.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. You have zero taxation if all your profits are reinvested in the company. 501c3 status, you hear that a lot. That's something that you have to apply for through the IRS. And I don't know, do you know, Michelle, is there like a limited amount of time or can you do that at any point? I think you can do that at any point in time.
Yeah, I think you get 6 months. You can collect tax deductible donations for 6 months before that approval happens.
If you do that,
pending approval, but if you get
must-
kicked back, if the IRS comes
Yeah.
back and says no, then you have to give all those donations back.
Or you have to identify with your donors that they're not tax deductible.
Right.
But you have to keep very, very good records if you start doing that before you get your official 501c3 designation. The cons to a nonprofit is sometimes people sitting on your board might have good intentions, but they might not be the best business manager. So you have to just be very careful of the talent that you put on your board. There's a general lack of a sustainability focus, possibly. And again, these are just generalizations. And then there's a lot of competition for funding. I mean, don't think you're just going to go out there and get it. It's very competitive. It's part of the C&E certification that, you know, you're a legit nonprofit.
One of the things that, and the big reason neither of our companies are nonprofits is, it might just be like good information generally. So as we talk about owners, if you look at all of them on this sheet, except for nonprofits, basically you can own that company. As soon as you become a nonprofit, you have a board. Essentially what happens with a nonprofit is that the community owns you. The community elects board members or selects board members for your organization, and then you report to them. And so there have been instances of people getting fired from the nonprofits that they started. There have been instances where nonprofits, you know, we talk about either positive or negative scope creep. We say, hey, we've identified a really cool opportunity here. We want to go after that. And because it's not in your charter or because the board of directors may not be on board, you may not be able to pursue cooler opportunities. You may also have negative scope creep where your existing board says, oh, well, but there's this $10,000 grant for this. We should create this program. And you end up kind of straying from your initial goal in the name of trying to be sustainable. So at the end, it's possible to lose control over that vision and over that dream.
Then I have, just moving through these really quickly because I know we're out of time. Public benefit corporations, I want to put this up there just because this is the thing that our government is pushing, where you're really focused on a public benefit. One good thing about putting the public benefit in your articles of incorporation or articles of organization, that means that once you're gone, that company that you create is still has a public focus, public benefit focus. If it's silent and you leave, then it may, that may leave with you. It has a nonprofit component, so like, let's see, you would have a revenue generating portion, but you would be able to divert a part of your profit to your social impact, not to the shareholders. Because a regular corporation, their purpose is to maximize profit and revenue for the shareholders, okay? So it kind of has both worlds in the public benefit corporation. It would attract capital just like a regular corporation. You'd just be looking for investors that have an impact, want to have some kind of social impact. And it also relieves your board of directors of some fiduciary duties, because by law, the directors are charged, they have a duty to deliver maximum profits for you. And if they do make a decision that doesn't maximize profits, then they've breached their fiduciary duty, and there are legal consequences for that if the shareholders want to take action. So that's relieved in the public benefit corporation. The negatives are basically, again, the overhead that we talked about, because you have to do more things. And then the third bullet on the cons is the director decision complexity increases because they must balance the pecuniary, is that right? Basically the monetary interests of the shareholders. They have to maximize the specific or balance the specific identified public benefit and the whole corporation impact on that. So it's a lot more complex than the decision making. And it's also very new. So then the next one that I'm really liking more and more these days is the limited liability company. We've talked about that a lot, but basically everything that you can do in the public benefit corporation, you could do as transparent or non-transparent, opaque as you want with a limited liability company, and you don't have all the director balancing responsibilities. You can write that in your documents if you want, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility.
You can also be more transparent. You can report
You can
more than
choose to.
is required, even in your own organizing documents. The risk of selecting one of these that necessitates a lot of that transparency is that you can't back away from it because it's baked into your corporate structure. You can be an LLC, not acknowledge any level of transparency in your organizing documents, but elect to be transparent.
Right.
And that's fine. There's no consequences to being more transparent.
And so I'm really going over that fast, and I'm not going over all the slides, but I'm here after the presentation if you have any specific questions that we can help you with. Okay, on to certifications.
Yeah, we have like 3 minutes left, so I think we maybe
making your
just
choice.
even abandon slides. I don't know.
Well, let me just talk to this one real quick
Sure,
on
okay.
the making your choice. So what I want to emphasize to you is do some homework before you would go meet with your legal counselor. So the more efficient and the more focused your questions can be, the less time you have to spend there, and you can save expense. But a lot of this information you can do some homework on before you meet with them. Certainly you want to consult an attorney. You definitely want to consult a CPA for tax advice, and consult other people like Jeff, because he's lived and breathed it. So he can tell you the real world view of it.
Yeah. Well, and to reiterate, the attorney and the CPA, you're like, oh, that's a bunch of expense I don't need. I'm starting up. I don't have a lot of money. I will tell you, we did not consult a CPA until we were ready to file taxes our first year. And he's like, oh, this structure, why did you pick this structure? And we're like, well, we thought it made the most sense. And he's like, okay, well, for the record, I could have saved you $25,000 in a tax bill. And it's like, oh shit, yeah, we should have paid for that $300 consultation.
You would have gotten money ahead on that. And the other thing is, when you file to formalize your company at the Colorado Secretary of State's office. You definitely want to do that, but also there's this email alert notification, and they now have a secure system so that only you or somebody in your company is authorized to update your corporate records. So I'd encourage you to do both of those things.
You also need to register with the IRS. That's a good opportunity for.
Well, that's a CPA thing.
A CPA and an attorney.
And one other thing that I do, which tries to prevent what your problem was,
yeah.
is I encourage the client, when we draft up your operating agreement, who is your CPA? This is how it's directing your expenditures and expenses and so forth. I always run those paragraphs by the CPA, and the CPA comes back with their blessing that, yes, this is what we want to do. Or the CPA can then raise their hand and say, well, wait a minute, you didn't think about this, or have you thought about this? Yeah. And then that can also help. But that is that's one of my rules around drafting.
Yeah, and
you need to have a CPA approve how we're going to take care of your money.
Yeah, because it's worth noting lawyers and CPAs aren't the same. They sort of seem the same when you don't know, and you're like, oh, I just want to start this company. Like, they're all business professionals, but the expertise is absolutely worth it. So real quick on the certifications and transparency, there's such a thing as a certified B Corp. That is unrelated to legal entities. We just at least wanted to mention that. So when you see somebody say they're a certified B Corp, you can be any of these and be a certified B Corp. The certified B Corp is put out by a company called B Labs, and they'll basically come in and look at your business model and score you and determine whether or not you get their stamp of approval. We can talk offline about that if you have more questions. The BBB is working on developing a certification for social impact businesses. There's not a lot of information around that yet. It's still in active development, but something to keep an eye out for. Social Enterprise Alliance is a membership-based organization, not really a certification or transparency, but a good, again, it's a stamp that you can put on your website that makes people think that you're a good social enterprise. Whether or not you are is related to the next 2 points. Social impact isn't what's in your legal structure. At some point, maybe when there's a really solid legal structure for social impact, maybe it will be baked into your legal structure. PBC, is Public Benefit Corp, is trying to be that, but it's really not. At the end of the day, it's what's in your heart. It's what are you trying to do. We could come up with a whole bunch of ideas related to certifications and transparency and all of that. At the end of the day, it's your customers that decide. If they think you qualify as a social impact business, do they want to spend money with you? Do they want to support you? Do they want to make donations to you? Do they want to advocate for you? Do they want to tell your story? You know, they're the people that are going to judge it. And so that's ultimately who you need to, that's who we report to. At the end of the day, as we report to the community that we're trying to have a positive impact on.
Well, you're not going to be sustainable very long if you don't have a positive impact. Any way you slice it.
So we have a slide. So
I think this one here.
Yep.
So today we talked about forming your company, but there's a lot of other legal considerations in terms of protecting your intellectual property, competes, non-disclosures, contracts, we've talked about that, employment, ownership partner agreements, buy-sell scenarios, and an exit plan. That's also something that you might want to think about at some point, who your exit target might be.
So I expect a lot of these will be subjects in future classes as more of this curriculum gets developed. These are probably, unless you have a case where it's clearly obvious you need to worry about non-competes or non-disclosures or intellectual property, something upfront. A lot of these things are things that may come along a little bit later in the process, and so it's not really, it's kind of outside the scope of a base intro, but at least worth mentioning. Additional resources to consult besides Joanne and I, although we're happy to talk with you, is more CCSI classes either related to this whole idea of legal entity and legal issues surrounding small businesses, or any of the other CCSI classes as a part of this initial curriculum. SBDC is the Small Business Development Center. They are awesome. CNE is Center for Nonprofit Excellence, also awesome. And SCORE is the Service Corps of Retired Executives. And so they're basically a group of people that will do some kind of loose business coaching and direction and that kind of stuff. They're all good resources to talk to and say, hey, I have this idea. Am I on the right track? What advice do you have? What resources do you have? What they all offer classes. Another great resource is either similar social impact businesses that are kind of trying to solve the same problems you're trying to solve, whether they're here or in another community, or other social impact businesses that are in this community that may be solving different problems but may be well networked within the community. One of the reasons I love being in the social impact world is because we're all sort of competing, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to maximize our social impact. And so I have found a lot greater transparency and a lot greater willingness to help amongst other social impact business operators, where a restaurant may be less inclined to like give you their recipes or tell you what their challenges are or whatever. If I can share some of the lessons I've learned because you want to start a similar business and I can't help more than 20 people a year, let's say, but you can go out and you can help another 20 people, I'm happy to share some of my experience and expertise. And that's not necessarily, in fact, it's probably actively not the case in for-profits. It's very often actively not the case in nonprofits because they're trying to protect their donor pool and protect their fundraising base and their grant base. And so they don't want to give away their secrets because it jeopardizes their financial sustainability. Social impact businesses are kind of fun in the middle. Other industry-specific resources, whatever it may be, for me, it's the Colorado Restaurant Association and those types of places. And again, I put attorney and CPA in bold because please just go talk to them. Just save yourself some trouble later.
One other thing that we didn't have on the resource list, I'll share the one book that I've read on this topic. It's called Missions, Inc., and it's fabulous. And each chapter talks about a specific thing like entity formation, marketing plans. It's really good. I'm now working on the Conscious Capitalism book, which again is good. So you might want to do a few resources like that as well if you're just trying to get used to this market and what, kind of the questions are and considerations. Those books are fabulous. And
Yeah.
they're not by millennials, by the way. They're by veteran business owners who have a social impact need.
And I would say
in their
if you can
businesses.
look at kind of what your dream is and what you want to do, there's probably somebody out there doing it, and there's probably a book written about it because they're probably big enough. Or if there's not, there's probably something close to it.
Right. There's some very good books out there.
Yeah,
So.
there's also a lot of case studies, and there's more information out there that you could possibly read in a lifetime. But there's some cool stuff.